I'd like to continue our discussion on mind parasites. It is my present hyperfixation, and I think it is worth a deeper dive, a deeper observation, a deeper analysis. Now, I must start by saying this, what I'm about to talk about, right? I hope to not present it as fact. I hope that it is not taken as fact. So I'll start by stating this. It's all speculation, right? I have no credentials in which I could speak strongly to say that this is absolutely the case, or that I'm certain that this is the case. However, if you find yourself in a situation where you look around, right? Let's say you're in a feast, right? At a banquet. And all of a sudden, as people eat, you start noticing people getting sick and then start throwing up. Now, without certainty, I would be able to say, hey, perhaps people are getting food poisoning. It's something, going on with the food that they're eating. And that might be a probability, but it might be something else. Perhaps the room is being gassed, right? Perhaps there's something on the water. Perhaps people are all coming down with a virus simultaneously, and these are all probable. And until I know for sure, I can only assume and make educated guesses, right? And so the most responsible thing to say would be to present an idea and do so basically with a label that it is fiction, right? Speculation. I don't know. But I do look around this world and I see something going on, and I'm not the first to see and not the only to see and to state. And I think that we've had thinkers throughout history, philosophers throughout history, writers, artists, sort of trying to get the collective to pay attention to something that is going on. And actually not just creatives in the traditional sense. We've also had quantum physicists, neuroscientists, psychologists, all sort of pointing out that there's something in the human psyche that is harmful to us, all right? But it seems that it's best addressed if you are aware of it. So awareness is what seems to be the first step. And so I thought about doing another episode on this and thinking am I being repetitive? And I realized that thought was exactly what I'm talking about, right? That invasive thought. Repetitive or not, isn't repetition the way we learn? Doesn't everything else in our society require repetition? If you say that you need to work towards something, you have a particular goal. Don't you have to repeat the process before you attain the goal? So then why is this invasive thought even popping up into my mind about me repeating a conversation about a topic and about a phenomenon that deeply impacts, I would say, everyone? From the Buddha to the Christ, no matter where you stand. All right? Buddhism would not have been as successful as it was and or is had it not been relatable, right? So in our present sense, we talk about, this went viral because it's relatable. Even the story of Christianity, when Christ was approached by the devil, I put the devil in quotes, right? There's a parable. How about we look at these stories not literally, and I'm talking about our Christian friends, and maybe look at them as analogies for something else. When the devil tells him, turn away from your quest and I'll give you everything. That always seemed absurd to me. If the devil knew that Christ was in fact the child of God or God himself simultaneously, right? Why would he even present that as an option? I will give you anything, when he didn't have the power to give him what he had already had. And so to me, and please understand, for those of you who are new to the podcast, I'm not religious. I pull data from all sources. So this is an analysis of any and all sort of stories that can help us sort of figure out what's going on in our reality. All right. So that, to me, smacks of an invasive thought because it has no basis on logic. If the biblical story says that the devil was in heaven with God, and I guess Christ at the time, then he would also be aware that he had nothing to tempt Christ with if Christ himself was there at the beginning, which is what we're told, right? So if Christ was there at the beginning, along with Lucifer before his casting down, then it would make sense that Lucifer would be aware that Christ is also aware that he had access to all of the wealth or whatever that Lucifer could offer him. So it made no logical sense. So I put out a video on my TikTok channel asking, could the reason why the devil was never destroyed by the biblical God be because the devil is an aspect of the biblical God, God's internal monologue? Now, that was just pure speculation. If you notice, that particular video is dramatically different from a lot of my videos. There's no painting in the background. I'm not set up in front of my lights. I think I'd come out of like the bathroom and all of a sudden I just got hit by this thought and I was like, I'm going to record it right now. And then it was like stream of consciousness. I cleaned it up a bit because I said like a lot, but it just came out of nowhere. And I recorded it and posted it. I didn't actually think. That was what was most fascinating to me, is that idea came out of nowhere. It wasn't thought of. It just came out of nowhere. And now I've just finished 2 books back to back. One was the ultimate Colin Wilson, which I reread. And then the second was called The Mind-Parasite, which I started and finished today. I was aware of it a couple of days ago, which is why I titled the previous episode, the episode leading up to this one, The Mind-Parasite, is because I knew, and I had purchased the book by the same name, The Mind-Parasite, and I knew I was going to read it and finish it today, and I did. But I had no idea what was in the book. But as some of you longtime listeners know, I have this sort of weird habit of directly quoting from a book before I read it, which is what has lent itself, this phenomenon has lent itself to my understanding of the nonlinear, approach to time. I don't perceive time in a linear fashion. Sometimes I'll say things out of time. And this happens a lot with the podcast. I will say something, honestly, like a direct quote from a book that I have never read. And evidence of which, like, at this point, I can show you records. You can look back. Like, if somebody really wanted to go through all of my podcasts and then find direct quotes, right, from, like, books or whatever, you can also look through, like, my Audible library to see when I made a purchase of the book. So this is all on record if somebody actually wants to do this. And then it will also show when I listen to the book as well. And you'll be able to see, because it's something I've started to note. I've observed this. I mean, I've talked about this throughout the podcast. You can go back all the way to like 2018, 2019 even. And now it's like, it happens so often now that you can even hear it in my voice, like the nonchalance of it. I'm just like, all right, it is what it is. All right. We all know that the flow of time is an illusion. We all know that all of time is happening right now. We all know, at least people who are listening to this podcast anywhere, are aware that your consciousness is not bound, your true self, right? Your brain does not produce consciousness. There's been no scientific research done to prove that. It's an assumption that the brain produces consciousness, and then people are just sort of programmed to accept it, but it's not true. In fact, evidence to the contrary are people who've had near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences are not only able to perceive things that they shouldn't be able to perceive if they were limited to form, outside of their body, but they're also able to conceptualize things or perceive things outside of the future, outside of the present, while they're out of the body, and they have access to information while they're outside the body. And typically these are people who are brain dead or have been declared legally dead. So there seems to be more evidence. You can dismiss them as anecdotal, but at the end of the day, it's still a thing, of people who outside of body are still perceiving. So that tells you that your nervous system, which we're told is what helps us sense reality, but also produces our sense of reality, in which our consciousness is just a figment, that's not true. There's no evidence to support that. Or I should say there's more evidence, I guess, to counter that, or to say that that is not a strong sentence, a strong statement. And not just people who've had out-of-body experiences. There are also people, for example, who've had brain trauma. Not recommending that you traumatize your brain, but either through a physical accident or imbibing of psychedelics, and they're able to perceive events before they actually occur. All right. So that should tell you then that if the brain is damaged, or if a damaged brain allows an individual to still perceive aspects of reality beyond what they were actually normally capable of before damage, then something else is going on there. So common sense takes the cake. So right now, what I'm doing is just recapping ideas that we've been discussing, kind of building up the foundation, repeating, so that your brain becomes familiar with it, and then the familiarity allows for you to sort of open your mind and accept more information in. So we're just setting the foundation here, okay? Now, let's talk about mind parasites. Actually, before we jump into that, let's talk about aliens. And let's talk about AI. See, there's some people, if you say aliens, they're still conditioned, even in 2022, when, the government has released paperwork documents saying that, yes, the UAP, it used to be UFO, but now they've changed the name to UAP, right? Unidentified aerial phenomenon, I believe is what it stands for, do occur. We've seen the videos of, jet pilots who are filming these, quote, spaceships, or what appear to be spaceships, sort of moving, in ways that violate the laws of physics as we understand it. So we've seen this at this point, but for some reason, it's like there's a part of your brain. I saw this on Lex Friedman's Instagram, right? If you ask the average person, do you think that the media lies to you? They'll say yes. I mean, more so now, right? But then you ask the same person, do you think that you're being controlled? They'll say no. And the thing is, there's a disconnect there, right? Do you think you're being controlled by the media? There's a disconnect there, because if we're I'm paraphrasing, it was actually just a cartoon, but I'm just telling you what I took from it. You can go to his page and look. But there's a disconnect there, right? You can't have millions, if not billions of people around the world sort of literally having their eyes and their attention deeply focused on the nightly news, the daily news, the newspapers, all of that stuff, telling them, quote, this is exactly reality and this is how it's going on. All right, you can't have that and then sit and have a conversation with the average person who tells you, what the news said, right? But then on the opposite end, they can verbalize and say that, well, we know that we're being lied to, but then why are you consuming this thing? And then why are you just taking everything that they say at face value? There's a disconnect there. So the same thing we're going to do is we're going to apply the same mindset when we talk about aliens, right? You talk to the average person now, right? Things are changing slowly, and you ask them, about aliens. You used to get a really weird response. Like if you used to talk about aliens, and people would think that you were crazy. And now it's just kind of like, I don't know. I mean, we can't be the only intelligent life form out there, right? So things are changing, but there's still that disconnect because of how we've been programmed, right? But the same individuals or the same group, not the same individuals, because obviously people aren't immortal, but there's the same group, the government, who told our, members of our society that there were no such things as UFOs or UAPs or whatever, that there were weather balloons, right? Or gas coming off of Venus or whatever the fuck, right? So they lied, 100 years ago plus. And then they instilled that lie in the media, right? And then basically made it so that anybody who challenged official stories was ostracized and made to feel like they were crazy, right? Anybody who actually recounted having an experience with a UAP, if you actually even had the bravery to speak openly about it, you ran the risk of losing your credibility, your professional credibility, even if you spoke openly about it. So that was not that long ago. So now you're noticing sort of like same sort of parallel where the average person is starting to think like, okay, well, something's definitely going on, especially once the government said, okay, yes, something definitely is going on. So for 100 years, regular average citizens have been saying, and not just average citizens, you've had scientists coming out and saying this, you've had professionals coming out and saying this, you had military personnel coming out and saying this, that, hey, we're seeing some stuff. But because we're programmed to ignore each other, nobody was willing to take the information in until we had a, quote, official response given to us by the media. And then boom, that was when people started to accept it as a probability. That's a little scary to me. And also it makes me wonder, like, what else is it that regular people are saying to each other that we're not going to, or it's going to take another 100 years. I hope it shouldn't have to take another 100 years for us to look backwards and go, okay, maybe we should look and listen to each other. But that's besides the point. Going back to my point, aliens. I'll talk about the AI thing in a minute, but aliens. You ask the average person, they say, okay, sure. Maybe there are aliens. But once again, going back to the media, their perception of what an alien would look like is highly, highly, highly constructed by the media. We are shown that should aliens, like 9 times out of 10, we are shown that should aliens come to our planet, they're going to look like basically just ugly versions of us, and they're going to come in spaceships. And our idea of what constitutes as intelligent is, once again, it's human centric, and it is defined by the media. A friend of mine on our Telegram group chat talked about, in reference to the last episode of the podcast, he mentioned he suspects that electrons themselves have to be intelligent, right? Because if they react to, we're talking about the double slit experiment in the previous episode, so that's what he was referencing to. So he said, look, if an observer can affect whether or not an electron, acts as a particle or a wave, then they have to be sort of intelligence, right? Because they're acting upon being observed. And I said that's true, right? Because a human being, when they're on a small level, on a micro level, if you stare at a person long enough, they'll change, right? They'll look at you, right? They can perceive it. And this is like documented, like even snipers in the military or like assassins, whatever, they've spoken about how when a weapon is trained on a target, they seem to know that they're being watched. Same thing with cameras. When a camera is trained on a human being and then another human being is observing this person or a person through the camera, the person being observed reacts, right? So on a micro level, an electron is more or less doing the same thing that a human being would do, right? So that's demonstrating something, right? On a macro level, when we know we're being watched, our behavior changes, right? So if you are in your house and you're kind of doing your thing, you're kind of going to behave differently than if, say, somebody put in a security camera in your house. Like, you're just going to do different things, right? Because the knowledge, the understanding of your being observed, right? The understanding of observation, occurring observation, is going to alter your behavior. So on a certain level, electrons are doing pretty much the same thing, and so do light particles are also doing the same thing. So that made me think, or that makes me think, that intelligence, we must broaden our perception and understanding of what it means to be intelligent. All right, I talked about this in the previous episode. Please, if you haven't a chance to listen to it, please do, because this is more or less a part 2, a follow-up to the mind-parasites episode. So keep that in mind, right? And in the previous episode, I talked about a fungus can be intelligent. Even if you do mushrooms, please understand that they have a mycelium network. The fact that they're able to form, Dr. Paul Stamens does a lot of research on this. It's telling you, the fact that they're able to form networks to tell you that they're operating with a certain level of intelligence. We seem to think, let's take a step back. So for thousands of years, not all, but some human beings believed that Earth was the center of the universe. Not all, but some, okay? And that was what was forced upon the masses, that was the concept. Although there were people who said that's not necessarily the case, they were largely ignored because, well, they were outliers in that particular society. But there were also civilizations who didn't hold that same view, and other societies, ancient societies, who didn't hold that same view. But for the most part, in the West, there was a view that, look, Earth it was largely influenced by Christianity, and it was a view that Earth is the center of the entire universe. And then observations showed otherwise. And I say the same thing might be occurring with intelligence. Now, this is a theme that's going to recur in this particular episode, thinking that everything is centered around us and thinking that it's just us and we're just alone, right? So we have to really stop that, start breaking that sort of assumption, breaking apart that sort of assumption, okay? So we now know that Earth is not the center of the universe, right? So then the next step is also understanding that human intelligence is not the center of intelligence. We are surrounded by intelligence. The fact that we're surrounded by all of these sort of creatures and entities, because they don't fall under how we would constitute intelligence, we just dismiss them, right? So animals are not intelligent, nor are they conscious. Why? Because they don't behave like humans. It kind of reminds me of what was said about people of color by, white supremacists, right? Well, their culture is inferior because their culture is dissimilar from European culture, right? Their gods are demons because their gods are different from European gods, right? And not even European gods, because honestly, Yahweh, that's an Israelite, that's a Jewish religion, but still, it was a religion that was hijacked and adopted by the Europeans and co-opted and then spread across the world. And then the concept of everything else that does not fall into this category is evil or bad or inferior. It's the same sort of disease that repeats, right? It's the same sort of mindset that's repeating, because a creature or a plant or a fungi or a virus or a bacteria does not represent or project its intelligence in the exact same way a human being is intelligent. Even a culture, right? So, for example, African cultures who live off the who live off the earth, right? They don't, they live off the earth. They live in unity with the earth because because Africans didn't destroy the rainforests and pollute the waters, right? We are less civilized, or we were considered less civilized than what modern man is doing now to this planet. Somehow this way we're living that has caused so much war and destruction and pollution and damage to the entire ecosystem of our planet. That's supposed to be more superior than, people who for hundreds of thousands of years just coexisted naturally with nature. Somehow that is inferior and savage and primitive, right? So back to intelligence. I guess what the news is waiting to deem as a sign of intelligence is if, fungi decide to build a plane, and then if you just see a bunch of mushrooms, grow hands and feet, and then build a plane and then fly the plane, then that's when we will be able to say that fungi are intelligent. When they match what we are and how we behave, then they'll be considered intelligence. Do you see how ridiculous that mindset is? You see how absolutely ignorant that mindset is? And you see how that blinds us as a species even? All right, so that's why I keep coming back to this. Now let's talk about aliens. And not the cartoonish bullshit that we've been programmed since birth of what form aliens would take. It's the same sort of repeated programming that has been drummed into our minds. Like, hey, they're going to show up on a spaceship and they're going to say, take me to your leader. They're going to come through. No, they're not. They're not. And an alien, just by definition, so you really have to unlearn. By definition, alien means it's just not of here, okay? Or it's like foreign, it's different, okay? This is why we call people in America, we call people from Mexico aliens, or immigrants, we call them aliens. I don't see how they're alien. This was originally part of I'm in California, this was originally part of their land, so it's actually we're the aliens here, but that's besides the point. That's how like warped and backwards everything is. But alien doesn't necessarily even mean from another planet. It could mean from another dimension. All right. So right now, string theory posits that there's 21 to 26 different dimensions. And then with CERN, whatever they're doing with their LHC, they're trying to find other kind of smaller dimensions that they may not have accounted for. But once again, we're operating from our own sphere of understanding, from our own sphere of perception. You could have dimensions contained within your own mind. And you could have access to other dimensions in your own mind. I'm going to read you 2 quotes from Colin Wilson, The Mind-Parasites. This first one's kind of long, but I need you to pay attention. It says, "You are not a mere object. Whether it is an illusion or not, your mind contains knowledge of all the ages. Inside you, there is more knowledge than in the whole of the museum, with thousands of miles of bookshelves. If space is infinite, how about the space inside of man? Eternity opens from the center of an atom. Now I saw that I was mistaking and thinking of myself as an object in a dead landscape. I had been assuming that man is limited because his brain is limited, that only so much can be packed into the suitcase. But the spaces of the mind are a new dimension. The body is a mere wall between 2 infinities. Space extends to infinity outward. The mind stretches to infinity inward. My inner world is just as important as the world outside of me." I'm going to need you to loop that a few times and really take it in, particularly the last 3 sentences or so, because hearing that opened my mind just a little. I just love when little chains just kind of break. I love when I read things or I have access to things, it just sort of the chains that have kind of have been tied around our minds. When I'm exposed to something that just breaks a link. I love that. I love that feeling. I love that experience. So I'll read it again. I had been assuming that man is limited because his brain is limited. But okay, sidebar. What did I say and what do I keep saying? The brain is limiting. It's not limited. It's limiting. But that's besides the point. That only so much can be packed or stored within the suitcase. Right? So we're told that our brain is a computer. So it makes sense. I actually do the same thing, right? I think that, okay, my brain is what is holding information. So I want to upload as much information into the brain as possible. That's not what I'm doing. This is a materialistic mindset for somebody. And you guys know how hard I rage against materialism. At the end of the day, it still has its holds on me. I am going to continue to, go out of my way to break these holds, but they're still there. Because even when you use certain words and certain phrases, it comes out without you thinking. The brain can't hold all the information. If you're outside of the body and you have access to more information than you knew while in your body, then something else is going on. The brain is not what houses the information. In fact, me exposing myself to all of these books and reading as many books as I can get my hands on, it's not because I'm trying to store information in the brain. That's still a materialistic mindset. It's because I'm trying to remind myself of shit that my mind already knows, which is why when I talk about things on the podcast before I read it, it's because my mind already has access to the information now. And then when I go and read a book, I'm only reminded of something. Even the word remind tells you what that is. I'm only reminded of something that my higher self, my consciousness, already knows. You hear what I'm saying? Sit with this. But the spaces of the mind are a new dimension. The body is a mere wall between two infinities. The body is a mere wall between two infinities. Space extends to infinity outward. The mind stretches to infinity inward. The body is a mere wall between two infinities. And the space of the mind, space in the mind, are a new dimension. Now, think about this. What separates out there, out of space, because we're still in space. We might be on Earth, but we're still in space. There's outer space, right? Imagine paying $88 million or whatever to go out of space, but we're all in space on this planet for free, hurtling through space for free. You just went to like a slightly higher level of space than like a plane does, but you're still in space because you're in space. Like, it's stupid. Or like, imagine being in a house, all right? Or saying like you're in like a building, all right? And you can go to different floors, but you're still in like the building, all right? Yeah, you could see shit, from higher, right? But imagine like you could pay $300 to go, to like the 13th floor, if they exist in your country, right? You pay $300 to go to the 13th floor to look at everything, right? You're still in the building though, right? Now, imagine paying $8 million to go to like the 18th floor. It's fucking stupid, but that's where the International Space Station is. They're not really leaving. They're just kind of going slightly higher. That's it. I'm not the first person to say this. Go on YouTube, type in Business Insider. And what's my friend's name? I can see his face right now. He's the African-American astrophysicist, Neil deGrasse Tyson. And then aliens. You should find an interview where he's basically talking about that. He's like, we think we're going to space. And he takes the globe, like a global representation of this planet or plane, whatever you want to call it. And he says, he makes his fingers like a pinch. And he's like, this is what we say we're going when we say we're going to space. We're barely leaving the surface of Earth. Okay. So just the concept of paying like 8 million, this is space. It's not like Earth is like in a fucking, like we're here, it's everything. And so your mind, your consciousness is contained within form, but the form is literally like Aldous Huxley called it, right? Like, confinement. I don't want to say prison, right? It's but it's a limitation. So it confines you to this particular form, but you are also space. You are dark matter. You are energy. You're just energy sort of confined. But within this form, when you shed the form, it's like putting gas into a glass, right? The gas in the glass, the oxygen in the gas in the glass is the same oxygen that's outside of the glass. It's just contained within glass. So if it's possible for dimensions to sort of pop in and out of existence out there, outside of the glass, it's also possible by definition. So Michio Kaku talks about this. He says that microscopic black holes are consistently sort of springing into existence in space, and you can Google this as well. So then, contained within your mind, which is the glass, right? should also be microscopic black holes, which means then your consciousness can sort of access. We're trying to go to outer space. We're trying to get on a spaceship. It's fucking stupid. Your own mind can go to other realities, to other dimensions right now. And I would argue that's what artists do. I would argue that's what people when they meditate do. I would argue that that's what people when they take psychedelics do, when people fast, when people have these experiences and they pull back information. When I sit and I record a podcast and I'm just like spewing this information out, and then later on I go and get a book, I'm not special. I'm actually normal. This is what each and every one of us are capable of. I just don't believe in the limitation that had been imposed on the majority of us that it's not possible. And so because I don't think it's impossible, it occurs. Because I think it's normal, it is normal. It is becoming more and more normal because I don't set hard limitations on what reality is supposed to be. And that is why I am passionately trying to do with this podcast, is to get you to also not set these stupid arbitrary limitations that have been imposed on you by people who want to limit you because they want to control you and have power over you. Do you understand what I'm doing here? So you can access, when you sit and you write. I wrote a song for the first time yesterday. I've never written a song before. I actually wrote a whole song, which, by the way, if you can produce and write music, I would love to actually bring that song into this reality. So what I did yesterday was a couple of things, twofold. One, I've been telling you guys about sulforaphane. It works. Sulforaphane combined with broccoli sprouts and mustard seed. Please Google it and read about it. It does work, and I take it on a daily basis. The problem, though, is that when I take it too much, it keeps me like high all the time, which is great, except for when I need to be creative, when I need to write. I've been noticing that I could literally, I feel high, not high and like out of it. I don't feel like I'm high like when you take like too much weed or something like that. I just feel like above it all, in the sense of like nothing really affects me, right? Like I can look around and like have something like happen and I don't get worried and I don't have any anxiety, anything like that. But it's good for a day-to-day existence to not have anxiety and to detach from from the internal monologue. I'm not even going to say from the internal monologue and the parasite, which we're going to go and talk about. That's great. But from a creative standpoint, I realized that when I go too long taking the sulforaphane with the broccoli sprouts combined together, I can't go deep enough. I can't go down deep enough in order to pull a lot of these creative ideas that I can normally pull from the deep recesses of like my consciousness, right? Because I'm vibrating too high. So in order for me to be able to relate to a day-to-day person, to average person, I can't relate from a high level if most people are on a lower level. So I need to be able to do something to lower my vibration temporarily, which means I have to actually allow myself to get depressed. This is a realization that I actually just realized a couple of days ago. And it sounds crazy and it sounds counterproductive, but this is my podcast. I can talk about whatever the hell I want. And I know that some people out there are actually going to resonate with what I'm saying. It's about control. You see, most artists, most geniuses, they create from this low vibrational state. Not that they're low vibrational people. So please don't twist my words. They're not. But they tend to be in that space, and artists know what I mean, right? Where you're sort of angsty and anxious and melancholy, and that vibe, that energy is where you can kind of pull information from. It's like the depths, right? So it allows you to sort of access stuff. The problem is that a lot of artists stay in that space, and I think that you can actually hack that. All right, so I think you can you can even hear the difference in my voice. I can tell just by talking. I'll tell you what I did. So I still took my sulforaphane yesterday, but instead I didn't take the broccoli sprouts with it. I just took the sulforaphane, and I also took more than a microdose of mushrooms. Now, I've talked about this on the podcast. Normally, I just microdose. It helps with the internal monologue. It helps me vibrate high. It helps me stay in control. And on certain weeks or whatever, or months when I notice that like things are off and like my internal monologue is particularly like strengthened or loud or hard to detach from, I'll bump up and I'll add the broccoli sprouts to my, I don't want to say like my herbal regimen or whatever. But then it keeps me too high. So then when I want to create, I can't. Or I can, it's just harder. Like I notice it is harder for me to like be in that space. So I also take the microdoses of the mushroom to also help keep me in a particular frame of mind, a particular state. But if I take more than a microdose, let's say like double what I normally take for a microdose, it shoots me up super high, higher. Now I'm actually proper high where I can feel it. Right. And like everything's funny and I'm like, yo, like this is awesome. And I love everything and music sounds amazing. But the reason why under normal circumstances, I don't allow myself to get that high is because what happens is the next day I drop, right? Because everything's fucking balanced, right? So you can't peak up without dropping down. So that's why I kind of stay neutral and microdose. But what I did yesterday was intentional. I knew that I needed to write, right? So I took enough to peak. And then I braced myself and I actually went into the process knowing that I was going to drop. And then in that drop is where I was going to use to create. And then when I want to get out of that space, once I'm done creating, I know exactly what I need to do to pull myself back up to neutral. And that's something that I'm sharing with you guys. And sure enough, that's exactly what I did. I experimented on myself. I'm not suggesting that you do the same. I'm only speaking for myself. I'm not a medical doctor. So please understand that this is just anecdotal. It's story of what I did. I'm sharing my story of what I did, not telling you to do the same thing, right? So I peaked and then I dropped. And when I dropped, I wrote a whole song. And what happened was I'd never written a song before, but as I was washing the dishes, I just started humming this song that I'd never heard before, but I was hearing it, guys. I heard, even when you hear the initial recording, like as I'm doing the dishes, I just turn on my voice memo and I just start like, I'm singing along. And then you could hear in the recording, I'm actually saying certain words like myself and again, but I was listening to a song that I'd never heard before, but I could hear the song. I was listening to a song that I never heard before, but I could hear the song. So as soon as I was done with the dishes, I ran upstairs, I turned off everything, closed everything. I tend to do really well with writing when I'm in a dark space for some reason. Go figure. But like literally, I mean, like it physically needs to be dark. Like I have my eyes closed and everything like that. I need like shade. So I closed everything, turned off the light enough so I could see what I was writing, obviously. I wrote this song and I was like, this is a song that I heard. At one point, there was a point where I was like, oh no, it's missing the chorus. And I heard the chorus and I was like, yep, that's the chorus. It wasn't even work. Like I wasn't even working. I was literally just like listening to music from like a parallel universe. Like that's what I told my husband. Then I sang the song, I recorded it on voice notes and I played it to him. And he was like, this is crazy. Like you just were like, yeah, I'm going to go write a song. And then you did. This is insane. I've never met anybody that does. I'm like, don't even like give me that much credit. Like I just hacked it. I just like stole somebody else's song for a parallel universe. Like don't give me that much credit, right? And I absolutely believe that we're all capable of doing this. We're all absolutely capable of doing it. It's just that people have been programmed not to, 42 minutes already, wow. People have been programmed not to accept it as a possibility. So if you don't think it's possible, then you won't be able to do it. But these are things that we are capable of doing and more. Now we live in a society, right, that tells us that we're nothing. Right? What's the favorite media that we see over and over again? We're insignificant punt scum. Nothing. We're not important. We're just swirling through space on a rock. And those videos where they zoom out and they just show you, this is you, you're insignificant. So like, fuck you and fuck your life. Like basically like that's the energy that like they're putting out there. I hate those videos. I've lived in this world long enough to know that if the general idea of something is like, this is like, especially if you keep seeing it being repeated over and over again on like the media, right? Like you're nothing, humans are insignificant, we're descended from monkeys, we're nothing, we're powerless, we're just brutish, nasty. First of all, these are all shitty opinions. Secondly, they aren't true. Like everything is the opposite of what you're told. You're not insignificant. I don't even know if there's like all of the shit that they're telling you that there is. What I do know though is that you are an entity that is capable of multidimensional, like tapping into multi-dimensions. I don't have to you do it, you do the work, you open your mind and you'll see. Like you become the proof. I don't need to show you proof. If you accept what I'm saying, you can show yourself proof. Nothing I can tell you can prove it to you. Nothing I can tell you should prove it to you. Prove it to yourself. Try it. I'm going to read you another quote. The mind stretches for infinity inside us. The mind may be a world of its own, like the world we live on, a dimension with its own creatures and entities and monsters. Now, this is not a direct quote from the book, but this was inspired by the book. So I'll read it again. The mind stretches for infinity inside us. The mind may be a world of its own, like the world we live on. A dimension with its own creatures and entities and monsters. Remember I said we've been programmed to think of the earth, or we were programmed to think that the earth was the center of the universe. Then we were programmed to think that humanity was the only intelligence in this entire dimension. Now, even in our own mind, we're programmed to think that it's just us in the dimension that is inhabited by our consciousness within our mind. We see ourselves as the center of our own minds, the way our predecessors saw Earth as the center of the universe. But what if we're wrong? I call my garage, my attic, and my backyard mine. And on some level, they are mine. However, these things are filled with creatures and insects who do not need my permission to live there. Perhaps the same can be said of the mind. I need you to really think about that. Like, open your mind. You know, there's a book, I always reference the Kabbalion, right? And it talks about how, like, the all is mind, the universe is mental. And from that book, I asked the question, when we dream, could the creatures the people that we see in our dreams, could they be creatures that we've created? And then are we gods to them since they exist in our mind? But I want to actually break that idea down and say, maybe we're not creating them. Just because my backyard holds insects doesn't mean I created those insects. If I can see the insects and they exist, it would take a certain level of, once again, ignorance and arrogance to think that I created those bugs because they exist in my fucking yard. It's dumb, all right? But if you're sleeping and you're perceiving people, perhaps you're seeing and perceiving people from other dimensions of who actually exists. Maybe it's not your mind just generating all this stuff, just like your backyard didn't generate all of these insects that you see now that are inhabiting your yard. Maybe the people that you dream about are not your creations, but actually entities, people, fully fleshed creatures that exist, even when you're not there to observe them, even if you're not aware of them. And the same could be said about a mind parasite, an alien parasite. Most importantly, an interdimensional parasite. You see, when I posted the video on my TikTok channel, I had one person tell me something like, why do you think that it has to be a non-physical? Why can't it have a physical origin? My response to that is because I don't think it's physical. But they said, well, everything that exists in this reality has to have a physical equivalent to that. My response was diplomatic, like, sure, I'm open to that perspective. I'm open to that mindset. But that's only because I didn't want to argue on a TikTok comment thread. The fact of the matter is, there are things that people who don't engage in traditional, conventional perception of reality, who are able to interact with entities, what we consider paranormal, which I would argue is not actually paranormal, because if it occurs, then it's part of being normal. Whether or not you want to put it in a little category doesn't mean anything. The universe doesn't care what you think. There are people who have access and can sort of they think they can control anyway entities, non-corporeal entities. I've talked about tulpas, things like that. And yes, perhaps you could argue that a tulpa is using a material mind in order to sort of manifest itself into this reality. And some have actually argued that the UAP phenomenon might have a psychic connection. There's a book called, I'm not going to remember the name. I want to say it's Limitless Mind by Russell Targ, but I'm sure I'm not 100% certain. So there's a table of that. But basically in that, whatever book I'm thinking about, it says that like aliens, when they were first sort of observed, they didn't actually take the form of flying saucers. There was a misprint in a newspaper article and somebody called it a flying saucer, but that was not the initial shape the person who, at least in modern time, reported seeing. But then once the collective started to perceive, or once the collective accepted that these aliens would take the shape of a flying saucer, a saucer-shaped ship, then from that point on, people started seeing saucer-shaped ships. So that tells me, like, you could argue that, okay, then maybe it's a sort of collective hallucination, but then that's kind of weird, right? And at that point, then you can also argue that our entire reality is a collective hallucination. If a bunch of people are seeing the same thing, then you can't just dismiss it as a hallucination. It's got to be something else, right? Or at least the next step above hallucination. Otherwise, then we're all just hallucinating, which I have argued that we are. But then if we are all hallucinating, then that should mean that everything then is a mental projection, which means your physical form itself is a mental projection, which means that you're not actually material. And even the sense of like solidity and matter is an illusion again, which then starts to get sort of like, meta a bit. And then the concept of what is discussed in the Kabbalion about all of this being mind. It is. I do take issue. Every book that exists in this reality will have lies sort of built into it, not intentional. It's just everything is dual in this nature. Everything is dual in nature, in this reality. Everything in this reality, to exist in this reality, has to be dual. It's like a law, almost. It's almost a law. Right? Everything has to have its counter. Day has to have night, right? Form has to have shadow, right? So I forget where I was going there, but the point is that if the person left a comment, what they want to believe is that in order for there to be a parasite, there has to be a physical representation. So she wants it to be something where, I don't know, you can take a pill or something like that and treat it, right? Like like toxoplasmosis gondii or the cordyceps. If you may not be able to examine it, but she wanted there to be like a physical thing you could put your hands on. And to me, it's like, no, that's based on a materialistic sort of approach. It's not necessarily the truth, and it's not necessarily a universal experience that things that people encounter in our reality have a physical sort of anchor or a physical body, unless of course you want to say that, well, your brain is the anchor, right? Then it goes back to then something is hijacking your brain or your mind in order to sort of affect reality. So it kind of negates her point. At the end of the day, though, let's go back to the statement of the mind containing within it its own sort of dimension, and your consciousness sort of like typing in. Now, this is a bit wild, and I still haven't fleshed out the idea, but imagine that in your mind, however you can conceptualize it, is like a black hole, okay? And your consciousness enters into and out of form through this black hole. So every time you sleep, your consciousness leaves. Like you literally are leaving. And I've talked about this leading up to this episode, but I really want you to think of that same idea of my older videos, but with this quote now in mind, because this is the quote that sort of inspired it in the past. But we're just talking about it now, the present, because the future impacts the past. Retrocausality, right? So imagine the space extends infinity outwards, and then the mind stretches to infinity inwards, and that the spaces of the mind are a new dimension in which the body is just a mere wall between two infinities. So if you're not your body and your consciousness can sort of come in and out of it the way like air comes in and out of a glass jar, right? Then it would make sense, or it could make sense for something non-physical to come into your body and harness or affect the body the way your consciousness affects the body. Doesn't have to be physical. Is there a possibility that it could be physical? That me wanting to sort of put this into a box of it being something interdimensional might be me, ignoring other possibilities. Absolutely. But the reason why this box right now anyway seems more probable to me is that it is something that you can starve this infection is something that you can starve simply by removing your focus from it. It seems to want you to focus on like the internal monologue, the visualization. It wants you to be afraid. It wants you to have anxiety. It wants you to feed the energy that you generate from these negative emotions to it with your focused intent. So to me, that doesn't seem like something that is physical. I obviously could be wrong, but if it's something that you can heal over time simply by detaching your attention from it, then to me, it feels like something else is going on. Like, it's not like if I have a mosquito, right? If I remove my perception of the mosquito biting me, it's still going to bite me, right? I have to physically do something to take it off. But if shifting my focus away from the mosquito stops the mosquito from like biting me, then that's something else completely, right? The fact that it needs a physical action for me to remove this thing from this parasite or even a leech from attaching itself to me and draining me, I can remove a leech from my body by taking a physical action from it. But this mind parasite only sort of falls apart if you remove, you can't physically pull it, you can't touch it, you can't see it, you can't observe it. It's not like we're not, you know what I mean? Like you can maybe take things in, but even psychedelics or whatever tend to be a temporary reprieve. You have to keep taking it, but once again, it affects your brain, but it affects your mind and allows you to be more aware of it. So something else is going on. It's a mind thing that's occurring. It's something that's happening in the mind. So that's why I think it's something that is occurring on a non-physical level, because it's something that you can change with your mind. But then again, you can make the argument that, well, you can change anything with your mind, right? So you kind of bring in the conversation of, for example, placebo effect. And then if that's the case, then look, take that argument and run with it. If it needs to be physical to you, then let it be physical. If you feel uncomfortable with it, with the idea of it being an alien, even if it's an interdimensional non-corporeal entity, if you'd rather think of it as something physical that you can sort of dissuade and destroy or starve with your mind, then take that concept and run with it, and then apply that same mindset then to any sickness that you have. Like if you're ever sick, right? Detach focus from the mind, detach focus from your mind, sort of perceiving it as a sickness, and then heal yourself in that way. So I don't want to close my mind to it. It's just, this is what makes the most sense to me at this moment in space time, that it's something psychic and it's something that's non-physical, because it responds. It acts upon your body, sure, but even the energy that it drains from you, like a physical parasite, needs something physical from you. Like a mosquito needs your blood, right? A tapeworm needs like your food. So it needs something physical from you. But this thing appears to feed off of your energy and it drains you. So if it's something that feeds off your energy, then it's non-physical. It's energetic. That's what makes the most sense to me, right? To start with the analogy that I led with in the beginning of this episode, if I'm in a feast or in a banquet and I'm looking around and people are just like, as soon as they eat, they fall to the ground. Are there other circumstances that could be the cause of what is causing people to be sick? Absolutely. But the most apparent to me is that it's something that they're eating that's causing the sickness. That's what's the most apparent to me. So what's most apparent to me is that what's affecting the human race is something that is energetic, because it's something that most affects the energy. You look around and most people are like vibrating low. They're sick, they're sad, they're in a negative state. Even to say something like, hey, you're negative, that's not talking about their physical state. It's talking about the state that they're energetically existing in. So that's telling you, even on a conscious level, on an unconscious level, if you say this person is a negative person, you are speaking truth to power. You're saying, hey, this is something energetic that's going on. I actually want to talk about that. I want to talk about particularly hold on. This is like deep. I gotta like grab my thoughts. I want to talk about two things. I want to talk about how some people, there it is. I want to talk about NPCs. So I want to take a different approach to NPCs. In the book, Colin Wilson's The Mind-Parasites, he doesn't use the term NPCs. He does use zombies. zombies of the mind parasite. So a zombie of the mind parasite, the way he breaks it down, are people, human beings, that have been completely hijacked by the parasite, by these psychic parasites. Like just completely taken over. And they're just reacting. Like they're not even thinking. It's all fear and anxiety. And they're just completely drained. And all they're capable of doing is just, like their routine. Get up, eat, go. You know what I mean? Like they're in a negative state. And I think that is a better explanation for what you would call an NPC than dismissing a person's entire consciousness because they exist, they behave in particular ways. I would actually say that when you interact with a person that appears to be by definition an NPC or quote a philosophical zombie, perhaps they're not, unconscious or to the point where they're just like largely controlled by the game. Right? If you're using simulation hypothesis, perhaps they're just that infected and that drained and that taken over that they're not even like they're just sick. They're just like that infected. I think that that's a more compassionate approach than like something that can be almost imitative of another person, because that also allows them to like the space where they can be healed. Any person sick can be healed. So I want you to be mindful of that. And the way you can find out if a person is sick, not an NPC, because you could be sick and conscious and but you're not conscious of the fact that you're infected. This is why I like this mindset, because it allows people to sort of like start slowly disconnecting from the internal monologue, whatever you want to call it, right? The way you can tell is that they tend to talk about a lot. They talk about things that are wrong. So out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks, right? It's a quote from the Bible, but I'm going to turn it a bit and say, out of the abundance of the mind, the mouth speaks. So if their mind is completely dominated, infected by a psychic parasite who feeds on negativity, then all they would be able to talk about are negative things. And that's how you can tell that they're sick and they're infected. Or like we're all infected, but some I think more so than others. Like think about COVID, right? What did we learn? There's some people who can get COVID and then a couple of days they're fine. And then there's some people who like deeply, like almost to the point where they lose their lives, right? But it's the same virus. It just affects people differently. But you wouldn't like call a person who's like deeply infected with COVID, like you won't make it seem like there's something wrong with them. It just means that they're more susceptible to this virus for whatever reason. It's the same thing, is that these individuals who we call psychic vampires, that's the other thing too, that I kind of talked about in the last episode. All of these books like make you go like how to avoid these psychic parasites, psychic vampires rather, is the kind of ongoing label. But it dismisses the human being. It almost demonizes the person. What if they're not vampires? What if they're infected by vampires, by psychic parasites? And so their actions are not their own, right? They're just sick. They've been almost completely hijacked by this thing, and it's taken over their actions. So you can see it from their actions. Once you start, I'm telling you, it's something, and I hope I'm able to hold on to this, which is why I record these podcasts. I know you guys like listening to the podcast, but they're mostly my memoirs. They're mostly like when I'm lucid, I want to sit and record this shit so that in case I lose this sort of coherence, all right? Because it's like Gurdjieff talks about this, and Uspensky as well, staying awake, staying detached from this thing. It's a constant thing. All right. So this is like a security. I'm doing this for myself. I mean, I love you guys and I'm glad you guys listen. Which, by the way, if you are a listener, I said this at the end of the last episode, but I had to like add the ending after I like published it. Guys, please help me out. I had some deeply infected people who didn't like what I had to say on like a couple of videos I put out, whatever. They took to my podcast and left me negative reviews, and then it dropped my ratings to a 4.9, which then triggered the parasite in my mind because it's not like a 5.0 or whatever. But that's besides the point. All that did was let me realize that, listen, if a person who dislikes your podcast and doesn't actually take the time to listen can leave bad reviews, guys, like if you actually like the podcast, like there's no advertisements. I'm reading all of these books. I'm sitting and I could just journal this shit and not make it public, right? But I'm trying to share the information. Like literally the very least you guys can do is just like take to Spotify or Apple and leave a review, because it's kind of like, why are people who don't like what I have to say, like actually taking time out of their day to like shit on the podcast? Like you guys, they're not actually typing stuff out, but they're just, because it's easier just to hit one star than actually like write, because they don't actually listen to the podcast. They just want to like cause harm because they're triggered, or I should say their parasite is triggered by whatever it is I'm saying. And maybe it's because it might help, or it's helping, but you guys can't sit and listen and then just be like, oh, great podcast, can't wait till the next one, and then like not actively do something to help. So, help. I would really appreciate it if you did. So sidebar, it helps us. It helps me. It has helped me. Just even talking about this stuff, I'm very mindful now of like conversations. So I'm very mindful now of like when I'm talking to a person, if I notice that they just keep talking about like their sickness, right? Now I can detach. I used to get drained, but now I can detach. And almost now I'm like, okay, this is a symptom of their sickness. It's not them. And I can start seeing the person's heart, right? So it's not them. It's that they're infected. So it allows me to still have compassion for somebody, for a person. Because when I go, okay, they're infected, right? Then I can sort of separate my emotions and not get triggered myself and not get drained myself, and basically treat them with the same way I would treat somebody who like has COVID and is like coughing around me. Like until I learn to, it's just facts. All right. Like I'm just going to guard myself a little bit, right? Until I get to my point where I'm immune, or I'm taking something that can protect me, right? Or boost my immune system, like a black seed oil, but for, my mind. I'm just going to know how to sort of like react to the person and create like a little bit of space between myself and them so that I don't get sort of infected too, or triggered as well, right? Because I've got my shit I need to work on. I've got the same parasite. They might have more, but I'm infected as well. So I'm not better than them. And that helps me also fight the parasite, because when you are like, it's called the ego, but it's not the ego. It's not the ego. I think that calling something an ego, especially because there's a duality there, because sometimes ego is said to be a good thing, right? Like Beyonce has that song, I Got a Big Ego. It's said to be a good thing. No, it's not the ego. Let's call it something else. There's a young guy who put out a video and he called it like Rocco's basilisk. So he named the parasite, which I thought was interesting. And if you are familiar with Rocco's basilisk, it's basically this thought experiment that says that like, should a super intelligence be developed in the future, it would basically ensure that we did everything in our power. The people who did everything in their power to bring it to existence, or they would be like put in a kind of hell or whatever. So it's supposed to be this like mind-bending like thought experiment that's supposed to like freak you out. It doesn't really bother me, but it's urban legend and things like that. I do find it fascinating. I don't want to like delve into it in this particular episode. I've talked about it in the past, and you can definitely Google it. But just just a heads up, they say it's like a mind fuck or whatever. I don't know. So that was what he called it, but I don't think we should call it the ego. I don't think even calling it invasive thoughts is something, because it's not. It speaks to the invasive part, which I like about that. And I definitely like it better than calling it like the internal monologue. But I want something that addresses that the internal monologue and invasive thoughts are actually the same thing. Because right now, when you call something an internal monologue, a monologue basically implies that like it's just you. But it's not just you. You're not talking to yourself. Something's talking to you. Because if it was you, you wouldn't need to sit and listen to it. You would just do. So if we're told in the society that that's your internal monologue, then when it listens, like we're conditioned to listen to when something speaks or somebody is speaking, right? You offer it an audience. So if you call it an internal monologue, then you're almost like predisposed to like listen to it, which then doesn't serve you. So we got to figure out the name for it. And if you guys have any ideas, you can comment on the YouTube and let me know what you think we should call it. Wetiko is a book that I recommended and was recommended to me. So that Wetiko is the mind virus. That's one perspective. Be mindful with that book because it tends to use kind of heavier words like evil, and it's kind of I prefer Colin Wilson's book, The Mind Parasite. or mind parasites rather, even if it's a work of fiction, because, and I don't even really like fiction like that, but of all like my favorite, like top 3 favorite fiction books, Recursion is one, Altered Carbon is another, and The Mind Parasites by Colin Wilson has become my 3rd favorite. But I love fictional books that just throw information at you like it's nonfiction, but your mind, like your right brain, can accept the information. You know what I mean? And it's less of a narrative, but the narrative is there, but it's not dominating. You're still getting lots of information. So it's well done. So I like that. And it has an optimistic like approach to it. So the author, Colin Wilson, he's an optimist. He writes like things that make you think, like things, for example, like he writes things like tragedy is not inevitable. Right? He writes things like many outsiders, right? The writers, the artists, the great thinkers, the great leaders, right? Many outsiders, the 1 out of 20. So in his book, it's 1 out of 20 human beings that are the outliers. He says that in the fictional book, The Mind Parasites, which I thought was interesting because I just finished watching season 3 of Westworld. And in season 3, Rehoboam or whatever, the AI, they also say on Westworld that it's 1 out of 20 human beings that are the outliers that like don't fit in, that are like a problem to the program or whatever it is. And I think that since it's recurring, I don't know if Colin Wilson influenced that 1 out of 20 or if it's like a separate quote coincidence. If it's a separate coincidence, then maybe it's speaking to something. Well, then that would mean that of 7 billion people on this planet, there's 300 million people who are just like us. And that's pretty dope. Like that's better than feeling like, like feeling alone, to know that there's like 300 million people out there that are just like you, that, know that something's off in this world and want to do something about it. That makes me feel awesome. So I like that. But Colin Wilson writes stuff like many outsiders cause their own downfall. So he's talking about the outliers. Through self-pity, they allow themselves to become weak because they're inclined to see life as futile and meaningless, or that it is so difficult that it is not worth the effort. I love that fucking quote, guys. Like, I remember reading that and thinking like, yo, that's true. And then I took a step back because look, the one thing I'm not going to be is fucking basic, right? So I already know I'm an outsider and I have a propensity towards like depression, but like, is that because I'm an artist? Am I depressed because I'm an artist? And if that's so, I'm a basic fucking artist and I'm depressed. Like, fuck that shit. It made me actually like, it made me say like, yo, fuck depression then, right? Like, then what's the point? I mean, you already had that article that came out that said it's not like chemical. So cool. And I could throw that shit off, right? So then if it's not chemical, then it's just a habit of self-pity and boredom, right? So when I read that shit, I was like, bet. Fuck that. I'm not about to be a basic person, right? Because the tragedy of the outsider, of the artist, and who do we tend to venerate? The artists who do take the fucked up route of like ending themselves, like Van Gogh. Like, I love Van Gogh. But then with this quote, I'm like, yo, like by him taking himself out like that, he deprived the world of like more of his art. Like, I would have loved to see where his art went. You know what I mean? Like that quote spun it. Like, it changed things for me because like, look, the reason why I've dealt with depression is because I know what happens when you fall into that melancholy, that's dark state. I've talked about it. You just, at the end of it, at the core of it, you're just like, life is meaningless, right? You're looking around and you're feeling sorry for yourself. It's like, it is self-pity, right? It's this sort of lethargy, a little bit of like laziness, a little bit of defeatist. It's a defeatist attitude. These are like, this is true. I know because I fucking deal with this shit. And the fact that I can actually use that depletion of energy to write creatively, and I'm like working on controlling it as opposed to letting it control me, that's a fucking alchemist's move, right? That's alchemy right there. But by reading him, he just put that shit out there boldly. Like, fuck you and your feelings. This is going to hurt your feelings, but you're going to take this information. It's completely different. But where are we getting ideas like life is meaningless? Well, it's been taught to us by other philosophers who felt that they had succumbed to that same mindset, which, case in point, is whispered to you by the fucking invasive thoughts, by the way. I know that because on my deepest, darkest moments, that's what I know. I'm zoning in and I'm listening to this stuff, which is why I have to take the microdoses and the sulforaphane, because it disconnects It disconnects my consciousness from being sucked into the left brain talking its shit. So I fucking know this. But when I read a quote like tragedy is not inevitable, many outsiders cause their own downfall through self-pity. They allow themselves to become weak because they're inclined to see life as futile and meaningless, or that it is so difficult that it is not worth the effort. That woke me up. I don't know about you, can't speak for you, may not wake you up, but that woke me up. And I was like, yo, that's true though. I need to stop that. I'm not about to be a basic artist. That's not going to happen. That's not going to happen. Listen to this. And that's why I would say I would recommend, this is a sidebar. That's why I would recommend the Mind-Parasites. Actually, was this from Mind-Parasite? No, this was from that quote that I just read you was actually from the ultimate Colin Wilson. I mentioned it last week. I mentioned it again. It started off slow, which is why it took me a while. I was like reading other things or whatever. So it took me a while to like finish it. But then like after like the first third of the book, it started getting good. So I went back and actually reread it. So I would recommend that. I recommend that you read that. Just brace yourself. You know, it's a lot of introduction to who he is. The first couple of chapters increase the speed, but then it starts going good. And this was a direct quote towards the end of the book. These are where he starts dropping just like nice gems. And so this was from the ultimate Colin Wilson. So I wrote this in addition to that quote. And this is what I wrote. I said, the tragedy of the outsider is so cliche. The tragedy of the outsider is so cliche. A tradition of defeatism, boredom, and futility is programmed into the mind of the artist. Don't be a cliche. So I wrote that. The statement, life is pointless and meaningless, is the self-indulgence of a philosopher who is lazy and weak. That's another quote by Colin Wilson. Now, that's a kick in the ass, isn't it? Right? And I wrote this. These are my words coming up. If our world truly is infected by a mind parasite, it would seem that those with the greatest propensity to change the world are the ones who are most infected. I wrote this before I read The Mind Parasites by Colin Wilson, and that quote almost verbatim was in the book. So there's my synchronicity for this book. I'd recommend you read those two books. Do with the information what you will. But I will say this, if you find that you are more prone to bipolar disorder, that you're prone to depression, to ADHD, to me, you can take one view of it and say it's chemical or whatever, that's fine. I myself, I'm not projecting on you, but I myself, I'm choosing to look at it as, okay, you know what? What if this whole thing, like what if what I'm talking about is true, right? And that there are in fact interdimensional sort of parasites that has infected the human race. It's not improbable, guys. Like, I know it sounds wild, but if you have the government finally admitting that, yes, UAPs are real, like they just don't know what it is, like, right? Then you can't then be like, okay, but that means nothing, right? And if you look around, it certainly seems that we are not living up to our full potential. Case in point, the reason why is like because we sit and we look at each other and we say, like, we've got to be able to do better than this. The fact that we are dissatisfied, that self-pity and that feeling that life is futile and meaningless comes from the great minds of our civilization, the greatest, like that 1 in 20. And if you're listening to this and it's resonating with you, you're in the 1 in 20, right? To look around and be like, it should be better than this. It should be better than this, right? Should tell you that on some level, we know that, okay, we can do. When you say it should be better than this is because you know that you can do better. That's not coming from nowhere. That's not coming from nowhere. And so if you're afflicted with depression, if you're afflicted with ADHD, if you're afflicted with bipolar or anything that looks like that, right? Please understand that based on this theory, that if something has truly impacted and infected the human race, and it's not just those two books, I looked up like invasive thoughts, like books on invasive thoughts. There's so many books written by psychologists and therapists and spiritual gurus and leaders. So like, this is not unique. Like, it's not a small thing. It's affecting billions of people. It's not talked about as much, but it should be. So if you fall into the category of maybe the 1 in 20, the outlier, the one who's looking around and thinking like, it should not be like this, it's because you have the propensity to impact this world, to change things. That's why you can look at it and say that, okay, it's got to be better than this. I can do better than this. We can do better than this, because it's up to you to change it. And I'm willing to argue that if this world is in fact infected by a mind parasite, it would seem that those with the greatest propensity to change this world are the ones who are most infected. Why are our heroes always troubled? I mentioned the book A First-Rate Madness a couple episodes ago. Actually titled the episode of First-Rate Madness as well, but it's based on a book of First-Rate Madness. Why are Martin Luther King's, Gandhi's, Lincoln, JFK, FDR, why are all of these minds, even Hitler, though he was on the complete opposite spectrum, but if you read about him, he was deeply infected too. But these are the people who had the ability to to change the world, and they did impact the world. But some of the greatest, the madness, the madmen, we call them mad, but are they mad or are they deeply infected? So the people with the greatest ability to impact this world are the ones who are most likely to be infected. And so you keep that in mind when you're dealing with stuff and it's going, the invasive thoughts are coming. It would not be coming for you this hard, pushing you to have these dark thoughts, if it didn't know what you were capable of lifting and uplifting the human race. You are the one that is capable of making the most change. I think it's interesting how everything converges, right? I had the friend who sent me the book. Every time I try to think of this book, it escapes me. A First-Rate Madness. All right, just out of the blue, she was I think I had recorded an episode. It was 4 episodes ago. She was read this book. I read it, and then I had put off watching season 3 of Westworld because, to be perfectly honest, I found season 2 to be kind of a letdown a little bit from season 1. It wasn't really a letdown. It was just different than what I was expecting from season 1. So I just was I'm going to wait until I'm ready for season 3. But then season 4 came out. So then I went and watched season 3. And in watching season 3, I get this quote and I'm seeing these stories about Rehoboam and the 1 out of 20% that happened. And then I read this book today. So the episode I talked about, I just watched literally 2 days ago, where they mention the 1 in 20 are the outliers, right? I'm not going to spoil it, but go watch season 3 for sure. Right. And then I read this book today, The Mind Parasites, right? Based on the topic that I given of the same name, right? That I hadn't even read the book yet, but I just titled the podcast. It's all kind of tying all together. So I think that there's something going on here, and I'm just going to roll with it. Right. But if you are an outsider, I'm not even calling you an outsider because you're not on the outside. You're here. You're just awake. You're just conscious. You're just paying attention. It's because you have the greatest potential to impact the world and change it. You're an outlier. You're the one. But the 1 out of 380 million. Right? But the majority of them are us, right? Deeply crippled by self-doubt. Well, what is self-doubt? Would you doubt yourself if you didn't have the internal monologue talking shit? That invasive, if you didn't have invasive thoughts telling you that this isn't good enough, telling you that, oh, don't talk about this episode because you've already been talking about, invasive thoughts, it's repetitive. Why don't you talk about something else? No, let me talk about this because this episode doesn't sound like last week's episode. Even in talking about it in this episode, there's more newer conclusions that I'm reaching and tying things together. And if I wouldn't have recorded, then I wouldn't have been able to create this episode and talked about the things that I talked about and made the revelations that I made, and hopefully to impact the people that will be impacted by listening to this. So fuck off. Right? So this is worth saying one more time. If you are infected or affected by depression, ADHD, bipolar, all this stuff, treat it however you want to treat it. But just operate with the mindset that if our world truly is infected by a mind parasite, it would seem that those with the greatest opportunity, the greatest propensity, the greatest ability to change this world are the ones that are most infected. Another thing that he talked about in the book, The Mind Parasite, Colin Wilson talked about, was that these parasites, the way they operate. Now, bear in mind, this is a fictional book, but that doesn't mean I can't pull stuff from it, okay? Same with the Bible. Other thing that it did mention is that the parasites in his book, they throw out red herrings to deliberately produce, to deliberately, I don't know why I can't talk, to deliberately fracture your focus. Fracture your focus. So I talked about this like a month ago. I talked about a friend who had sent me this like conspiracy theory chart. And intuitively, I looked at that chart and I said, something has created all this shit to basically fracture your focus. If you're focusing on this and that, this and that, you're splitting your focus and stopping yourself from looking within. I said that. I said it on the podcast, and I read the book today, and I can show you proof of when I purchased the book and when I read it, and you guys know when I said it because it's all recorded. But clearly, this was the book that influenced me saying that. My future impacting my past. So all of these conspiracy theories are just distracting. Stop. Because when you're busy thinking about all this stuff, you're not training your mind in exertion of will. We're going to come back to that. Free will. Free will is not given. It has to be exercised with deliberate and constant and repetitive execution. You start by meditating. Every time you catch yourself, you don't have to just sit in the morning and in the night. Every time you catch yourself zoning out, catch yourself, remove focus, remove attention, sever the focus on the invasive thoughts. Shift your focus to the present moment. What are you doing right now? Meditate throughout the day. I mentioned the simulation hypothesis only so I can say that if you're uncomfortable with the concept of Earth being invaded by aliens that we cannot see because they're energetic and they're interdimensional rather than extraterrestrial, then use simulation hypothesis and just say, okay, the simulation has a virus, right? It's a virus that has corrupted our programming, right? And the best way for you to basically delete the virus through time is to constantly stop giving it energy, cut off its source. And its source of energy is your focused attention. When you generate negativity, negative energy, right? So electricity, that's negatively charged energy. So electronics can feed off of negative charge energy. So your electricity, your phone actually feeds off of negativity in a way. Indirectly, right? So if the same thing can happen on a physical level, the same thing can happen on an energetic level. So you can starve this virus by disconnecting and not giving it any of your energy, saving that information, that energy for yourself. Actually, I want to see if do I want to tie it to Nope? I want to tie it to Nope. I'll tie it to Nope. If you haven't seen it, don't listen to the next 5 minutes. But basically, I'm going to try to say what I have to say without spoiling it. But there's a monster that if you look at it, it consumes you. If you give it your focused attention, it consumes you. I think indirectly, I don't know if he's saying this consciously or not, Peel, but I think indirectly that's what he's saying. Or it's one of the things he's saying anyway. He has said that the movie is about spectacle and, how humanity seems to be moving to a space where everything we do is about spectacle. Right? So there's something very serious going on, which is a species of aliens, it's killing people, but they're more caught up in trying to record it so that they can make money, right? Rather than, holy shit, this is a thing that's actually happening. They want to capture it so that they can make money off of it. Sorry. Okay. End of spoiler. But I wonder if the two are not correlated, right? If you want to like say, okay, simulation hypothesis, and if you believe in, AI, and you want to pull in, Rocco's basilisk, we can have that conversation. If you want to table aliens, at the end of the day, it's all basically saying the same thing. Something needs your focused attention. Your attention is super powerful. That is why it needs your focus. It cannot consume you if you don't give it to, if you don't feed it. Right? If you don't focus on it, if you don't, that's it. So let's just use whatever analogy we need to use to get us to where we need to go. Remember, at the end of the day, life is meaningful. Life is only worth living when your will is concentrated. So you need to get yourself to the state where you work day to day to exert your will over your own mind. Nothing should shift you. Every time you catch yourself lost in thought, listening to it, because it's always negative, right? That's why I said it's like electricity. It needs negative. It needs you to generate negative energy. If you're talking to somebody and they're going off, don't take it personally. Understand that person's infected. It's not even them talking. It's the parasite that's talking through them. It's not them. Just tell yourself this person has a psychic parasite. They're infected. It's not them. They're infected. And then disconnect. Disconnect. The most powerful thing you can do. Disconnect. Every act of disconnection from the mind, not even the mind, from this invasive thought, from whatever it is we're going to call it, from negativity, from engaging, every second every act, every instant that you catch yourself listening to this thing and you disconnect, that is how you learn to, over time, concentrate the will. And then once again, imagine what and how powerful a being you can be, where you take all of that energy that is being siphoned from you on a daily basis, a moment-to-moment basis, and you pull it back into yourself. You can practically stop yourself aging because you can regenerate with that energy. All right. I'll tell you a story and I'll end it with that. So when we just moved, but we moved like a while ago. And our new home, when you walked into the garage was like cold. And I was like, is this like a climate controlled garage? Like, why is the garage so cold when you're running the AC? But then the bedroom, like upstairs, was like hot at night. I don't sleep very well when I'm hot. So I had an AC person come and look at it. And he was like, well, you have all this air that's being generated, right? But it's being like drained. So the main house is not cooling because the energy is being drained into the garage. So he sealed it. He sealed it off, cleaned out the vents. And then for the first time since we moved here, I was like cold as shit. Like middle of the night, I'm fucking freezing. I was like, awesome. I love this. All right. That's what you're trying to do now. Because now that when you seal the source, you seal the leak of energy, this is not something for you to be afraid of. I guess I should say, I probably should have led with this, but it's not something you should be afraid of. But understand that you are leaking energy. Something is draining you. So you have to seal the energy. So every time, think about it like it's like a hole. There's a hole in your mind. Right? Let's think of it like a microscopic black hole. And there's an entity on the opposite side of your mind, and it's in there. You want to seal it from coming into your mind. You want to seal that black hole. So every time you catch yourself listening to this thing, all right, every time you disconnect, you put a little bit of like a seal. Like you just seal it. Over time, day by day, continuously, consistently, repetitively, repeatedly, you will eventually seal that out completely. And then you can take the energy that's being drained that you generate on a daily basis, and instead of allowing that shit to drain you, you can use it to regenerate you. Now think about what you will be capable of if you weren't constantly being drained. Thanks for listening.